Hey, Zach here. Today in Stewartstown, Pennsylvania, we're going to be checking out the Stewartstown Railroad, a short line that's been going strong since 1885, despite all the odds. There's going to be a lot to check out, so let's get started. In my previous video on the Northern Central Railway in New Freedom, PA, I showed the old junction point where the Stewartstown Railroad branched off. Before we explore the current state of the Stewartstown Railroad, let's delve a little bit into its history. Southern York County in Pennsylvania has a long history of agriculture that stretches back to before the formation of the United States. Early settlers were drawn to the area by the rich, fertile soil, and farming quickly became the backbone of the local economy. Farms, mills, and other small businesses thrived, but the region was landlocked, far from navigable rivers or canals that could carry goods to the distant markets. For decades, farmers and merchants relied on slow, horse-drawn wagons to move their products over rough roads to places like York, the Susquehanna River, or even as far as Baltimore. That all changed when the railroad came through the area in the 1830s. Now, the farmers and producers had a faster, more reliable way to move their goods beyond just the local markets. What had previously taken days by wagon could now be accomplished in hours, opening Southern York County to new customers, new industries, and new ideas. But the railroad couldn't be everywhere, and producers still had to cart their goods to the local railhead, usually by those same slow, horse-drawn wagons. 7 miles to the east, Stewartstown was close enough to the railroad to benefit from its presence, but far enough away to make the trip to the railhead burdensome. By the 1860s, the town was not only surrounded by productive farms, but home to businesses ranging from furniture makers to wheelwrights and lumber yards. Throughout the 1860s and 1870s, serious consideration went into a potential railroad connecting Stewartstown with the NCR. In the early 1880s, stock in the new railroad was bought mostly by the local farmers and businessmen at $50 a share, and the Stewartstown Railroad was officially chartered in 1884. Construction started immediately, and the line was completed in 1885, running from a junction with the NCR in northern New Freedom to its namesake town, with a few stops in between. The first locomotive was purchased from the Baldwin Works in Philadelphia at a cost of $5,300. Named the Hopewell after Stewartstown's home township, it pulled 3 trains daily in each direction between Stewartstown and New Freedom. In 1885, the Northern Central Railway built a combination passenger and freight station in New Freedom to handle the increased business that the new line would generate. Here we can see that station in 1912, with the platforms on the right of the tracks built to serve the Stewartstown Railroad business. The railroad was profitable right from the start, and it fostered an economic boom in Stewartstown that lasted well into the 20th century. But the 1930s brought hardships in the form of the Great Depression and competition from trucks and automobiles. As a means of survival, the railroad adapted, trading in its aging steam locomotives for gas-powered engines that were much less expensive to operate. Here is the first such engine, purchased from Plymouth Locomotive Works for about $11,000. Despite a general decline in business through the mid-20th century, the Stewartstown Railroad did survive, in large part through shipper loyalty. But in 1972, Hurricane Agnes came through the area and destroyed much of the NCR track, leaving the Stewartstown largely unscathed, but severing its connection to the outside world. While the NCR was completely abandoned south of the Mason-Dixon line, the tracks in Pennsylvania were eventually restored, and after 12.5 years of inactivity, in 1985 the Stewartstown Railroad was allowed to run trains on the ex-NCR tracks, from New Freedom to York, Pennsylvania. Since the railroad had continued maintaining its equipment and infrastructure during that time, it was ready to go. Unfortunately, only a handful of the businesses that it had previously serviced remained in operation. Increasing losses for the railroad led to the suspension of freight service in 1992, although excursion trains continued to run on Stewartstown trackage until 2004. 2 years later, in 2006, a volunteer group called the Friends of the Stewartstown Railroad was formed, and in 2008, members began working to rehabilitate the tracks so that trains could operate again. Through the tireless efforts of these volunteers, the railroad is back in the passenger excursion business, offering train rides for all occasions along its historic 140-year-old original scenic route. So let's go check out some of the sights along that route, starting at its old junction point with the NCR in New Freedom. The Stewartstown Railroad begins just opposite the NCR station in New Freedom, and its tracks actually run parallel to those of the old NCR until finally branching off in the northern section of the city. Here we can see the tracks stretching off to the east, as a number of sidings converge down to one main line. The line runs largely behind the scenes for a mile and a half until it crosses Main Street in southern Shrewsbury. Now, back when the railroad was built, this crossing wasn't actually part of Shrewsbury yet. It was a separate small village called Hungerford. Over the years, as Shrewsbury grew, it absorbed the smaller settlement, and these days Hungerford is just a memory. This was an important location on the new railroad, because here it interchanged with the Baltimore-York Turnpike. Industries grew up at this intersection, including a cannery on the west side of the road, the Anderson feed mill just north of the tracks, and the sprawling Chase wire mesh plant just up the tracks a bit. All of these businesses had their own sidings, and the cannery even had a coal trestle. In 1925, a small brick station was built to handle the railroad business in the area. These businesses are long gone, but the station does still stand along the tracks. Here we see the tracks approaching the crossing from New Freedom. And across the street is the old brick station, which was last manned in the late 1960s. At 100 years old, the station itself is in great condition. On the side, we can see a freight door, and behind the station there is some stored railroad equipment. Here we can see some track remnants from the siding that used to split off to the right to service the wire mesh plant. The building itself is still there and now houses a retirement community. But we can see where the siding used to run down along the building. Here is an old picture of that siding in action. Back to the station, we can see a couple more freight doors on the other sides. There is a bumper here, probably for the siding that used to cross the street to the cannery. The old coal trestle for the cannery would have been right about where that gun shop is now. There's also a little bit of track left from the siding that serviced the Anderson feed mill. You can see the door where they would have loaded the boxcars. From here, the tracks go underneath Interstate 83 and continued on to Tolna, one of a number of small communities that was once serviced by the railroad. The house here used to be the combination post office, store, and train station. The structural remnants we see here are from an old warehouse that was used to store agricultural products. Whoever lives here now literally has the tracks in their front lawn. But that doesn't stop them from putting up a lot of Christmas decorations. The tracks continue along next to Deer Creek Road, weaving back and forth across the street and at times crossing the Deer Creek itself. The tracks continue on, hugging the side of this valley here. And just a little further on, there used to be an elaborate wooden trestle. Maintenance of this trestle proved to be costly, so it was torn down and filled in pretty early on in the railroad's life. The tracks curve back around to run parallel to Route 851 for a while. Here they are crossing Hill Road. This bridge was built in 1895, replacing the original one that was at this location. A little further on, the tracks run right next to the highway for a while. Just outside of Stewartstown, there are a couple of interesting sights. First is this stone arch culvert over Ebaws Creek. Incidentally, I believe I am standing on the original road's right-of-way. We can see the remains of a bridge abutment and some paving still in the ground. Just down from the culvert is this rather interesting looking bridge. The earliest bridge at this location was made of wood, but it got damaged by a flood in 1901. The railroad replaced it with a second-hand iron bridge, which lasted until the mid-1920s. At that point, the railroad replaced the iron bridge with a shorter steel span, which required extending the abutment from its original stonework. The weirdest part is that they kept the iron girders in place on the sides, even though they no longer serve any kind of structural significance. We can see that they're not even attached to the bridge at all. Moving along, the tracks enter Stewartstown from the west, passing right in front of this shopping center. We can see the town center just ahead, but first I want to backtrack down the tracks a little bit. The railroad built its coaling and watering facilities just outside of town, and there are some remnants of them to be seen. The first thing we come to is the concrete remains of a coal bin. In operation, coal from the bin would have been shoveled from the storage platform to the tender. It's possible that there used to be a trestle here to aid in delivery of the coal, but that would have been a pretty high trestle. Unfortunately, no pictures could be found of the place when it was still in use. We continue on a little further, crossing a little bridge, and passing a stack of old rails. And eventually we come to a foundation that once housed a 10-foot-high, 7,500-gallon tank for watering the locomotives. Water was brought to the tank by pipe from a nearby spring. Just like with the coal dock, no pictures seem to exist of this water tower. We're heading back now, and next stop is Stewartstown itself. Now there's a lot to see in Stewartstown, so let's look at an aerial view first. From above, we can see that the tracks split into a Y in the middle of town. Most of the Y is used for storage at this point, but the branch to the southwest is essentially the main line, leading to the current station at the bottom of the image, which sits at the corner of North Hill Street and West Pennsylvania Avenue. The current engine house is just inside the Y on the west side, next to North Hill Street. Just above the Y is the skeleton of the old Stewartstown Furniture Factory, which burned down in 2024. Now, I couldn't find any old maps of Stewartstown, but here is an aerial shot from 1938 that will help to see some of the businesses served by the railroad. We see the furniture factory still intact. There is also a cannery just north of the Y, and a lumberyard just west of the Y. With respect to old railroad buildings, we can see the old engine house just across North Hill Street from the current one. And we can even see the old station building which sat on the east end of the Y. Back on the ground, we'll start our exploration down by the station. We can see that there is a small yard here with the tracks coming right up to the street. There are a variety of rail cars parked here, including a GE 80-ton switcher and an old Monongahela caboose. On the tracks closer to the station, we see some cars used for the excursion rides, including an open-air car and a couple of coaches. This station was built in 1914. And we can see from this old photo that it hasn't really changed much over the years. On the far side, we can see a cargo door, but as far as I know, there was never a rail spur on this side, so it was likely used for unloading of wagons and trucks. Parked by the station is a caboose used in the excursion trains. We can see that both the caboose and the station are decorated for Christmas. The station does open up when the excursion trains are running, but unfortunately it is closed today. There's not a lot of room on this passenger platform between the building and the trains. I like that they have an old freight wagon here. I'm sure it saw a lot of use through the years. This platform extends well beyond the station, and it looks like these days this is just a storing ground for old railroad infrastructure. It is curious that the platform extends so far. I almost wondered if this was a sidewalk right beside the tracks. There are a lot of sidings crammed into this little corner. We don't have to go too far to get to the beginning of the Y. On the right, we can see the water tower for the old furniture factory. We can see some old rail cars stored in this fenced-in area, but we'll get a closer look of these from the air in a bit. For now, we'll continue down the main line. On my left is a barbecue restaurant that is smelling pretty good as we approach lunchtime. According to old records, there used to be cattle pens on the left side of the tracks here. Here comes the spur leading into the railroad's current engine house. We can see the side of the building acts as a billboard for the railroad itself. The switch track beside the building actually leads to the northern section of the Y, which we can see is completely jammed with stored railroad equipment. There was also this disconnected section of track that likely led to the old engine house, which would have stood approximately where that yellow building is now. Here is an old picture of that engine house before the newer one was built. Now let's check out what we can see from the air. Hovering over the station area, I still remember the first time I saw this place. It was about 15 years ago, and I was in Stewartstown visiting a friend, and we were walking down to get ice cream at the place across from the station. Now, I had heard that there was some train stuff in town, but the whole station and mini yard right next to the road like it is was way more than I was expecting. I can tell you that the ice cream was all but forgotten, as I just had to explore everything. And since then, this has been a favorite place to come back to check out the progress as the volunteers brought it back to working order. So here we are above the Y, and you can see the engine house at the top with the main line going off toward New Freedom. Here is the burned down husk of the old furniture factory, and that Dollar General is sitting right about where the old cannery used to be. We can see all the equipment stored on the northern branch of the Y, including some old passenger cars. At the eastern end of the Y, we can see just a hint of the siding that used to service the furniture plant. And the old railroad station would have sat just to the right of the tracks, where that parking lot is now. Here is an old view of that station, built in 1898 as the first dedicated station building in Stewartstown. Before that, the railroad used space in a pre-existing building near the tracks. It is remarkable how much the old station looks like the newer 1914 one. The old station building did find other uses over the years, but it was finally torn down in the 1970s. Here we can better see the remains of the furniture factory, established in 1903 and in business until the late 1950s. It was known for producing good quality wood furniture for all rooms. Here are a couple of the pieces produced there. In more recent years, the building housed an auto parts warehouse. As close as the fire was to the tracks on the Y, it's lucky that none of the stored railroad equipment was damaged. And that pretty much covers the Stewartstown Railroad in its namesake town. But there is at least one lingering question that I wondered about from the moment I first discovered the place. Did the railroad really end here at West Pennsylvania Avenue, or did it once continue on? It sure looks like that building could have once been serviced by the railroad, especially considering the placement of those loading doors. The short answer is yes, the tracks did continue on, in more ways than one. Across the street, where the Sheetz gas station is now, there used to exist the Stewartstown Milling Company, which we can see here in this old photo. One of the tracks from the small yard would have continued over to service the mill until it burned down in 1943. The mill was eventually rebuilt across Hill Street, where the railroad already had a spur in place to service a sewing plant a little bit further down. The building on the right here is that newer mill building, repurposed for a new tenant. And the old sewing factory building has been incorporated into a newly built retirement community. But that's not the end of the story either, because the tracks, for a time, continued on a lot further than those two businesses. Almost immediately after the Stewartstown Railroad was completed, people in the communities to the east saw how beneficial the line was, and they petitioned the railroad to consider extending the tracks to Fawn Grove. When the Stewartstown officials didn't show any interest in this idea, these farmers and businessmen decided to fund and build a new railroad themselves. Chartered in 1905 and completed in 1906, the New Park and Fawn Grove Railroad was a 9-mile-long line that extended from the end of the Stewartstown tracks to a terminus in Fawn Grove, with a number of small stops along the way. The new railroad was in an interesting position, as a short line daisy-chained onto another short line. The New Park and Fawn Grove Railroad was run independently of the Stewartstown, but it was reliant on their tracks to access the outside world. For trains running straight through from Fawn Grove to New Freedom, locomotives and crews would be changed in Stewartstown. This is likely the reason that the 1914 Stewartstown station was built where it was, at the time on the main line between the two railroads. While the new railroad did help to grow the towns it passed through, it was never as profitable as the Stewartstown. And in 1923, the Stewartstown Railroad assumed control of the then faltering line, in an attempt to make it profitable by streamlining operations. This solution kept the line operational for another decade, but the effects of the Great Depression, as well as competition with trucks and automobiles, forced the Stewartstown to abandon service beyond its namesake town in 1934. The infrastructure was ripped up and the equipment was repurposed, and the short 18 years lifespan of the New Park and Fawn Grove was at an end. Although the railroad has been gone for over 90 years, there are still some remnants of it to be found. So let's go check them out. Looking south of the Stewartstown station, there is little hint that the railroad actually continued past the sewing factory, but we are essentially flying over the path that it took. The tracks ran parallel to Route 24, south out of Stewartstown, sometimes running right next to the road. On this section, the tracks would have been on the right side of the road here, before eventually crossing over and running through the fields on the left. On the other side of the cornfield, Wiley Station was one of the stops on the railroad. The tracks would have followed the path of the telephone lines here. Wiley Station itself was located just to the left, and the building actually existed until fairly recently, as we can see on this Google Maps street view. The tracks would have continued past this building, which was an old store with its own siding. The old store can be seen in this photo from 1915. Since this photo was taken, the building seems to have grown a second floor, which could explain the different siding style on this addition. In any case, you can definitely see where the right-of-way was here, continuing straight on toward the town of New Park. And for further proof that this was the right-of-way, just a short walk down Marsteller Road, we find this old bridge abutment, dating back to 1905 when the railroad was first built through the area. The tracks continued on, paralleling the road, until arriving at New Park, which had one of the main stations on the line. Here we can see the path the tracks took through the town and the spot where the station used to be. The tracks would have crossed Woolen Mill Road here, coming through this residential area and curving along the edge of this field. Here we can see that same spot from the air, and it's hard to imagine that a track actually ran through here. If we move back just a little bit, we see this school bus parking lot, which is essentially the location of the old station building. Here is a picture looking at the same area when the tracks and station were still there. That siding visible on the right serviced a nearby cannery. From the station, the tracks would have continued straight along here, crossing the road and running across the fields in the distance, eventually making their way toward the terminus in Fawn Grove. A school complex was built on the right-of-way to the west of Fawn Grove. The tracks would have curved around and come through the town on its north side, with the station being located on North Market Street and the engine house and facilities a little further along. While most of the evidence of the railroad in Fawn Grove is long gone, the old station and engine house structures do still exist. The station is the building at the bottom of the screen here. It exists as a private residence now, and that red-roofed section is a later addition. The tracks would have come through that wooded area and past the station on the right. They would have continued on, servicing the grain mill across the street, before ending at the engine house, which is the green-roofed building dead center. Here we can see the station at ground level, and we can compare it to this old image from 1920. This station was built in 1913. Before that, the railroad used space in this feed mill for its station facilities. This building was located just across the tracks from the surviving station building. In front of the station building, the dilapidated paving actually might be revealing some concrete remnants from the old railroad, which seem to be aligned with the old right-of-way. The grain mill across the street also shows some evidence of old train service, with this abandoned cargo loading door. I imagine that a siding ran right up alongside of the building, but I couldn't find any evidence of it on the ground. Down the line a little bit, the old engine house has been repurposed as a shopping center. The building itself is newly sided, but peeking under the porch, we can see the old facade, complete with what is likely the old engine house bay doors. While the New Park and Fawn Grove Railroad is long gone, it is amazing to find some of these relics of the old farm-oriented short line that owed its existence to the Stewartstown Railroad, itself a short line, but one that is still going strong 140 years after its inception. And with the continued support of volunteers and the revenues from ongoing excursion trains, hopefully it will continue to exist for many years to come. Well, I hope you liked this look at the Stewartstown Railroad and the New Park and Fawn Grove Railroad. One still alive and kicking, and the other long lost to history. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to like, consider subscribing, and leave a comment. I love hearing from you. Until next time, see you later. I just want to take some time to credit these two books, which were vital in nailing down all of the historical information about these two railroads. I can't thank the authors enough for their tireless work in putting these volumes together. If you are interested in learning more about these railroads, I definitely recommend picking up a copy for yourself. They can both be found in the Stewartstown Station gift shop, while the New Park and Fawn Grove book is also available on Amazon.com.